Hello and welcome. You are listening to Pint Size Therapy, where we explore all things related to mental health healing, personal growth and development, emotional wellness, and the human experience in pint sized bites. I'm your host, Dr. Aletha Clark, a licensed psychotherapist, certified hypnotherapist, and master addiction counselor, and I am happy to have you here with me today as you embark on your mental wellness journey. While I appreciate you tuning in, don't forget this podcast is informational only and is not a substitute for seeking out your own mental health counseling with a licensed professional. So join me as we jump into today's episode. Hello and welcome. Today's episode is a heavy one, but it's an important one. We're going to be talking about Sean Diddy Combs' trials. Not the celebrity gossip, not the headlines, but the real mental health consequences of what's being revealed. We'll explore what happens to the mind and body in abusive relationships, why victims often don't or can't leave, why bystanders don't intervene, and how the rest of us are absorbing this, sometimes without realizing the toll it's taking. So let's breathe and begin. So, if you've been following the news over the past year, you've probably seen the coverage of multiple lawsuits and allegations of abuse against Sean Diddy Combs. After many years, surveillance footage from a hotel incident was released, a moment that many say validated long standing accusations of physical and psychological abuse. And here's what I want to say up front: abuse doesn't always look the way people think it should. It doesn't always start with violence. It's often quiet at first. It's subtle. It's confusing. It often begins with power and control, manipulative behaviors that happen in small, systematic steps. At first, they might even seem reasonable: checking in often, wanting to spend all the time with you, criticizing your friends. But over time, these patterns kind of isolate and wear down a person's sense of autonomy. And the person experiencing it often doesn't realize it's happening until it's too late. It escalates over time, and by the time the outside world notices, the damage has often already been done. So, when it comes to intimate partner violence, there's this haunting question people often ask: why didn't they just leave? And that answer is really layered, because sometimes the abuse is so subtle at first that victims don't recognize it until they're deep in, because they may have been isolated from friends and family, because they become financially dependent, because they've been told they're nothing without their abuser, because they fear for their safety, and because they don't think anyone will actually believe them. And in high profile relationships, this just adds a whole nother layer: the layer of being fearful of destroying someone powerful, of being discredited, of being dissued, threatened, and even silenced. As a therapist, I've sat across many people, not celebrities, just everyday people, who stayed in abusive relationships for years. And every time I saw strength, not weakness. I saw people surviving the best that they could with the resources they actually had. Now, let's talk about the people around the abuse: the assistants, the security, the entourage, the friends and family, and even the public. Why don't people step in? For most people, it can be their own fear, their own trauma, but adding another layer of celebrity and wealth, it can be the power, the dependence, and the retaliation. Sometimes it's because they're being controlled too. Other times it's because they've normalized the behavior, or they believe they can't afford to speak out financially, emotionally or professionally. And for many, witnessing abuse creates what's called moral injury, the psychological distress from watching harm happen and feeling powerless to stop it. We can't have this conversation without acknowledging the role of immense power and what that does to both victims and bystanders. In the case of Sean Combs, we're not just talking about a wealthy man. We're talking about someone who has built a multi decade empire across music, fashion, television, alcohol, and media. Someone who could make or break careers with a phone call. Someone with access to legal teams, PR firms, private investigators, and an entourage designed to protect the brand at all cost. For someone inside that world, a partner, a friend, or even an employee, speaking out doesn't feel like an option. It feels like a death sentence, not just professionally, but emotionally, financially, socially, and sometimes even physically. When survivors talk about being afraid, it's not irrational fear. It's often fear grounded in real experience. It's the threats, the retaliation, the surveillance, and even the intimidation. When bystanders remain silent, it's often because they too are being watched, or because they've seen what happens when someone does speak up. The reach of that kind of power can be paralyzing. It creates what we call coercive control, not just over a person's actions, but over their choices, their voice, their sense of reality. Coercive control is a pattern of behaviors that strip a person of their autonomy through isolation, surveillance, manipulation, humiliation, and threats. And it's often invisible to outsiders until it's too late. But the truth is, this isn't just about one man's actions. It's about a larger system that enables abuse when power goes unchecked. It's a system that includes the entertainment industry, which often protects profits over people, those non disclosure agreements, NDAs, which are routinely used to silence survivors under the threat of legal consequences, a culture of celebrity worship where fame is equated with virtue and calling out wrongdoing is seen as betrayal or disloyalty, and even social media where survivors are often mocked, doubted, or re traumatized in the public view. All of these factors create a climate where silence becomes survival and where escaping or exposing abuse feels not just dangerous, but impossible. That's why stories like these matter, not just because of who's involved, but because they force us to confront the structures that allow abuse to thrive behind closed doors and red carpets. Abuse is fundamentally about control. It creates an environment where the victim doesn't trust themselves, where their needs, their boundaries, and safety are slowly eroded. This kind of trauma can leave deep scars, PTSD, disassociation, self blame, and even suicidal thoughts. And here's what's even harder: that trauma doesn't end when the relationship ends, it lives in the body. It shows up in new relationships, in your sleeping patterns, in the way someone speaks, how they flinch or freeze. That's why healing takes time and why compassion is essential for ourselves and for others. Now, let's talk about us, the collective we, because whether we realize it or not, we've all become part of this trauma cycle. We are not just passive observers, we are participants in a culture that recycles pain and shock, outrage and apathy over and over again. In this case, the Diddy trials is not the first. Think about it. We watched the R. Kelly trial unfold for decades, which was a not so quietly kept secret dating back to rumors surrounding his relationship with Aaliyah. We saw the revelations from the Jeffrey Epstein case, a tangled web of systematic abuse, cover ups, victims pushed to the margins. We followed the Harvey Weinstein trial and the cultural reckoning it actually sparked. And more recently, we've seen lawsuits against other powerful figures in entertainment and sports. Each time, the cycle repeats: silence, breaking news, outrage, disbelief, memes, debates, victim blaming, and often silence again. We absorb all of this. And over time, we either become numb or we become activated in ways we don't always understand. This feeling of that numbness, that feeling of that activation, this is called vicarious trauma, and it's real. It happens when we're repeatedly exposed to the suffering of others, especially suffering that reflects a power imbalance, a moral injury, or unresolved pain in our own lives. We might lose sleep, become irritable or hypervigilant or emotionally exhausted. We might avoid the news altogether because we feel helpless or paralyzed, or even internalize our shame, anger, or despair without even knowing why. But there's another layer. We are also being conditioned by this repetition. Our collective empathy gets worn down. Our shock reflex, it fades. We scroll through headlines of unimaginable abuse while waiting for coffee, while picking up our kids, while replying to emails. It becomes part of the background noise of our lives. And here's the cost. We start to normalize this behavior that should never be considered normal. We begin to expect violence and manipulation and silence as a part of power. And worst of all, we might begin to doubt survivors, not because we don't care, but because we're overwhelmed, we're disillusioned, or afraid to fully take in the truth. In a way, we've all inherited the trauma of these stories. We carry them in our nervous systems, in our conversation, and in our collective psyche. And that's why we have to be intentional, about how we consume these stories, about how we process them, how we care for ourselves and each other in this aftermath. This is not about tuning out. It's about tuning in with boundaries and awareness. You don't have to watch every clip or read every post to be informed. You don't have to engage in every online debate. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just pause and reflect. And just ask yourself, how is this affecting me? What do I need right now? What kind of world do I want to help build? And remember, it's okay to feel affected by these stories that are not directly your own. Personally, as a clinician and as a human being, this trial has stirred, a lot in me. I feel heartbreak for the survivors who felt paralyzed and trapped. I feel rage at the systems that enable abuse and villainize the victims. I feel grief for those who couldn't speak up until now, and for those who are still feeling silenced. But I also feel hope. I feel hope because we're actually talking about it. We're not looking away. We're asking those hard questions. And that's kind of where, our healing begins. So I want you to focus on that, right? And so if today's episode kind of resonated with you, if you're a survivor of abuse, or if you're someone struggling with the aftermath of trauma, please know this: you're not alone. You're not weak, and help is available. Here are some resources I encourage you to explore. The National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE, or thehotline.org. You can look at RAIN, which is Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, at 1-800-656-HOPE, or RAIN, RAINN.org. Also consider therapy services. You can find a therapist in your area by looking at psychologytoday.com or even through your local mental health clinics. I thank you for holding this space with me today. And until next time, I want you to take care of yourselves and take care of each other. As always, thank you for joining me today on Pint Size Therapy. If you found this conversation meaningful, I invite you to leave me a comment, like, subscribe, and share with your family and friends. Come visit my website at pintsizedtherapy.com, where you will find resources to accompany our various discussions and encourage you to continue your wellness journey. Once again, I am Dr. Aletha Clark. Until next time, remember to protect your peace and take care of your mental health.